My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for both cartographers and historians. But the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical, it is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests where any chosen emphasis supports some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual.
The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history, in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media.
Understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments and their attempts, through politics and culture, to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to a common interest. Cortes then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberatedness that accompanies a strategy, to paralyze the will of the population by a sudden, frightful deed. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set early, as Columbus had set in the islands of the Bahamas. In 1585, before there was any permanent English settlement in Virginia, Richard Grenville landed there with 7 ships. The Indians he met were hospitable, but when one of them stole a small silver cup, Grenville sacked and burned the whole Indian village.
Not able to enslave the Indians and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes, in his history of early Virginia, American slavery, American freedom. Since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions, let them settle down and plant their corn wherever they chose, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of the massacre, the English had avenged the deaths of that day many times over.
William Bradford, in his History of Plymouth Plantation, written at the time, describes John Mason's raid on the Pequot village. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived that they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fryer, and streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and the scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hand, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy.
The elite of the Puritans wanted the war. The ordinary white Englishmen did not want it and often refused to fight. The Indians certainly did not want the war, but they matched atrocity with atrocity. When it was over, in 1676, the English had won, but their resources were drained. They had lost 600 men. 3,000 Indians were dead, including Metacom himself. Yet the Indian raids did not stop. Behind the English invasion of North America, behind their massacre of Indians, their deception, their brutality, was that special power drive born in civilizations based on private property. It was a morally ambiguous drive. The need for space, for land, was a real human need. But in conditions of scarcity, in a barbarous epoch of history ruled by competition, This human need was transformed into the murder of whole peoples. That quick disposal might be acceptable to the upper and middle and upper classes of the conquering and advanced countries. But is it acceptable to the poor of Asia, Africa, Latin America, or to the prisoners in Soviet labor camps, or the blacks in urban ghettos, or the Indians on reservations, to the victims of that progress which benefits a privileged minority in the world? Was it acceptable or just inescapable to the miners and railroaders of America, the factory hands, the men and women who died by the hundreds of thousands by accidents or sickness, where they worked or where they lived, casualties of progress? And even the privileged minority must it not reconsider with that practicality which even privilege cannot abolish, the value of its privileges when they become threatened by the anger of the sacrificed, whether in organized rebellion, an organized riot, or simply those brutal individual acts of desperation labeled as crimes by law and state? If there are necessary sacrifices to be made for human progress, is it not essential to hold to the principle that those to be sacrificed must make the decision themselves? We can all decide to give up something of ours, but do we have the right to throw into the fire the children of others, or even our own children, for a progress which is not nearly as clear or present as sickness or health, life or death? As Hans Koenig sums up in his book Columbus, his enterprise, for all the gold and silver stolen and shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. It gave their kings an edge in the balance of power for a time, a chance to hire more mercenary soldiers for their wars. They ended up losing those wars anyway, and all that was left was a deadly inflation, a starving population, the rich richer, the poor poorer, and a ruined peasant class. On their own, the Indians were engaged in the great agricultural revolution that other peoples in Asia, Europe, Africa were going through about the same time. While many of the tribes remained nomadic hunters and food gatherers in wandering, egalitarian communes, others began to live in more settled communities where there was more food, larger populations, more divisions of labor among men and women, more surplus to feed chiefs and priests, more leisure time for artistic and social work, for building houses. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together and the catch was divided among the members of the village. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership and land and home was foreign to the Iroquois. Women were important and respected in Iroquois society. Families were matrilineal, that is, the family line went down through the female members, whose husbands joined the family, while sons who married them joined their wives' families. Each extended family lived in a long house. When a woman wanted a divorce, she set her husband's things outside the door. As Gary B. Nash notes in his fascinating study of early America, Red, White, and Black, thus power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominancy and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on, in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is even to make us question for that time and ours the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and leaders of Western civilization.